Hello, dear friends. Today I have got my hands on this lovely book on castles from my local library. I have always had a great fascination for castles from a very young age. The romance, the history, the architecture. So I very much look forward to flipping through this book with you. As you can see, it's a substantial book which starts with the 11th century Hendermen and moving right up to modern Castle. So we may have multiple parts here, but let's get started. First of all, I suppose it's important to define what is a castle in relation to a fort or a palace. A fort would be a defensive building needed to protect the lands around them and to act as a base from which attacks could be launched. They weren't used as homes for nobles like castles were, and palaces were private grand residences for royal rulers or other high-ranking leaders. Palaces weren't built to be defensive structures, so a palace would have struggled to withstand a long siege, unlike a castle. So this is an example of a medieval castle, which is, I suppose, the ones that we're most familiar with. If you asked a child to draw a castle, they would most likely draw one that looked quite similar to this, right? So a medieval castle, like Podium Castle in England. So we've got different castles through the ages here as well. A modern bailey. I've grown up near a lot of modern bailey structures before. That's what this is up here. So it was made of wood and a keep that sat on top of a steep hill called a motte, and the area around it, the bailey, was enclosed by a wall. So very basic, but very hard to invade, I suppose. We have, of course, classic Roman forts, hill forts. You've got concentric castles there, lovely shape. But now two walls, two defensive walls, a higher inner wall and a low outer wall. And here we have fairy tale castles. While most castles were fortresses designed for defence and were constructed simply to show the wealth and power of the ruling family. This is Hohenschwangau Castle. Hohenschwangau. You got Neuschwanstein as well, which is a beautiful Disney-like castle. Well, it inspired Disney. A star fort there. Koryaku Fort in Japan. Amazing structure, that. Star-shaped moat. So here we have Hen Domen in Wales, April 1071. On an early spring morning in Wales, people were already bustling about the castle of Hen Domen, from lighting fires to tending the fields. There was plenty to do. So this is a modern bailey. They're formidable but not too challenging to build. It was newly constructed at this time, so craftspeople are busy creating homes for new residents. So you've got a fewer entrance to guard, so most of it's walls, so you've only got a main entrance there. And then only specific people are allowed in. Some had dry moats, which are huge ditches, making it harder for people to invade. This is the bailey. Most day-to-day activities took place in the walled courtyard. It's like a mini village. Bakers, craftspeople, weapon makers, launderers, and chickens. Don't forget the chickens. And then there's only one way in or out. In the keep, a high-up building, and a good view. It was built in the 11th century by Lord Roger de Montgomery after King William of England had given him some land. Only the hill remains visible today. organised to excavate as an archaeological expedition, the longest in history. Interesting. So when it comes to excavating, well, why do some castles disappear? Some are destroyed in war, some fall into ruins, or might have been torn down to make way for newer buildings. Of course, ones made from wood would have rotted away. So if you find a location, you have to look at written records, maps, 3D laser imaging to find hidden features. Defensive ditches, of course, make a clear indication of where that must have been. Digging, drawing, reconstructing, sorting artifacts. Oxford Castle in September the year of 1142. This is built in the 11th century by Robert de Oily on the orders of King William I of England. So it was originally a modern bailey but rebuilt in stone to strengthen it, and remains of the castle are found at the heart of the city of Oxford. So it was used as a prison from the 13th century right up to 1966. That's incredible. Oh, we've got Stephen's army on its way to besiege the castle. Empress Matilda was a famous guest in September 1142. She was the rightful queen and had been battling her cousin Stephen for the crown of England. Many nobles didn't think a woman could rule, but Matilda was determined to claim the throne that had belonged to her father, King Henry I. Although Stephen had many supporters and his army was approaching to try and trap her. So I think this still stands today, St. George's Tower, a rectangular in shape, but got thinner near the top to help stop it toppling over, so a good watchtower. And a Welsh monk who stayed in St. George's Chapel wrote stories about the legendary King Arthur. So it seems like a couple of months later, there was a daring escape. Stephen's army had surrounded Oxford Castle and had trapped Empress Matilda inside. Her surviving soldiers and her were huddled within the thick walls of St. George's Tower, watching their supplies dwindling by the day. But the frozen river gave them an idea. In the dead of night, the Empress and the three of her closest knights sneaked out of the castle walls, and that's amazing. This happening in 1142. This is true. The river was frozen over, so she just straight up ice skated away. She's dressed in a white cloak to keep her hidden in the snow. She managed to scale the castle walls and silently skated across the frozen river to safety, and then the next day the residents of the castle surrendered. Wondered what happened there then, afterwards. Medieval society, so we have a hierarchy here of people within medieval society. We've got servants and peasants. Nobles gave peasants small farms in return for money and a portion of the food they produced, and some worked as servants for people in a higher class. Then you have craftspeople and bailiffs, who could earn money and status by making goods such as armour, shoes or candles. They also helped their lord or lady to manage their lands or worked in court of law. You then have the clergy and knights. Lower ranking members of the clergy, such as priests and nuns, reported to the bishops. Many of the clergy, unlike others, could read and write, and a knight was devoted to his lord or lady. Could be called up to fight for them. Lords and ladies and bishops, nobles called lords and ladies, served the king in return for large areas of land, and often lived in castles. Religion played an important role in society, so bishops were high-ranking members of the church who could also live in castles. And then you had the monarch. His royal rule was absolute, so the king or queen had the power to make almost every decision for the country, created laws, declared or ended wars, owned the land, and were responsible for their citizens. Very similar to Japanese society, which had a feudal system with an emperor at the top. Here we have Carcassonne Castle, which takes us to Jordan in the Middle East, a mighty Crusader stronghold. It was an imposing castle, but Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was set on besieging it because of the castle's ruler, Reynaud of Chatillon, had made attacks on surrounding cities. And an important wedding was taking place. Reynaud's heir, Humphrey the Fourth of Toron, was to marry Isabella of Jerusalem. Nothing would stop Saladin, but he did direct his weapons away from the newlyweds' rooms. And eventually supporting forces came to Reynaud's aid, and Saladin retreated. It's very respectful of him. He had a deep dry moat here, separating the castle from the gatehouse. The army brought trebuchets to try and damage the walls. There it is, it's here today. It's a spur castle, meaning it's built on a hill or a spur, making it easier to defend. Building it on Oh dear, Reynaud executed prisoners by fitting boxes on their heads and throwing them over the castle walls. That's not very nice, is it? Here we have the medieval banquet. Oh, look at that pig's head. That's very ornate, isn't it? Garnished with fruit and herbs. A real delicacy. Beer, made from wheat, barley or oats. Because water was often unsafe to drink, so beer was drunk instead. Some beer was brewed by women known as alewives, and I think it's important to note that this isn't beer as we think of it. It's I don't think it was even necessarily that alcoholic. It was just effectively a brewed, fermented alternative to water, which was too dangerous to drink. Because we had our fresh fruit, we had potage, a thick soup made from meats, grains and vegetables, common for both the rich and the poor. Bread plate. They put their food on stale bread plates called trenchers. Forks didn't exist yet, so people used a knife or their fingers. Cheese was popular. Spices. Cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg and cloves had to be shipped from abroad. Pheasants. Elaborate dishes adorned with tail feathers. Château de Gisors in France, January 1193. It was perched high on a motte, commanding view of the surrounding countryside, built in France. Their king, Richard I, had been captured abroad, and without their leader the soldiers were very worried. It was a key castle that the French king Philip II desperately wanted to capture. And it wasn't long until that happened. One of 20 castles built by the English King William II in France. It was effectively England in France. In the 11th century, King William II ordered Gisors to be built to protect English lands in France. Henry I and II added stone fortifications, but the castle was repeatedly captured and eventually became part of France. Apparently the Knights Templar the legend goes that they have buried treasure in the motte, but that has never been found. Château Gaillard, August 1203. It was built in under 2 years, between 1196 and 1198, to protect the English region of Normandy. In 1314, 2 future queens of France were kept prisoner in Gaillard's underground cells and had their heads shaved. If the Statue of Liberty stood in Les Andelys, the top would only just reach the level of Château Gaillard. So it was originally built again to defend English land in France, but it was now ruled by Richard I's brother, King John. The river Seine used to transport goods. It had a strong river defence tower on a small island to block the waterway. Small walled town. So it was then under siege during the winter. The English townspeople were safe within the walls, but the same defences that kept the French out also stopped supplies from getting in. King John had tried to rescue the castle but failed. The English fought off attack after attack, but then the French found a way in through a latrine or the toilet chute. Oh dear, because toilets and castles were often tiny rooms built into castle walls with a wooden bench with a hole in the middle sat over the chute. So a handful of soldiers climbed up the smelly toilet chute and then entered in. They tried to light fires to get them to retreat, but they let the rest of the army in, so the English were overwhelmed and the castle surrendered. And it led to the withdrawal of English from Normandy. Here we have siege weapons. To try and take over a castle, you've got a ballista, a big old crossbow, which was first used by the ancient Greeks, battering rams to force the castle doors open, a trebuchet, a super slingshot, a siege tower, which could help people get into a castle by simply being pushed up right against the walls. Carcassonne, very famous walled city. There it is today, very identifiable, iconic. So it originally began as a fortified settlement named Carcassonne, constructed by the Romans in around 100 BCE and expanded over hundreds of years. In the 20th century, a Roman-style theatre was built inside the city walls. And it's massive, so the ring wall surrounding Carcassonne was over 1 kilometre long. And to protect the nobles, a castle fortress was built within called Chateau Comtal. This was the last defence of the castle, where the nobles would meet and discuss everything that was happening inside and outside the walls. Its strategic location had made the city a target for invaders time and time again, and the Lord of the Citadel, Raymond Roger de Tencaval, was about to become the next target of a crusade against his citizens. I wonder if how much intelligence they had at the time. Would you know that an army was approaching through your network of spies and informants, or would you just have to prepare because you literally saw an invading army appear over the hill? Because the Crusaders Attack in August 1209, they wanted to destroy the Catars, and a religious group who had broken away from the Catholic Church, and many of them lived in Carcassonne. They, just 6 days before, burned a nearby village to the ground, and negotiations were going nowhere. Temporary wooden hoardings provided protection to defenders while they fought off the enemy. And fire, of course, was a formidable weapon against that. Turrets here to shoot arrows from. The giant cat was a shelter put against the fortress to protect attackers while they battered a hole in the walls. Like their namesake, some cats had claw-like arms to dig through the stones. Archers hid behind tall walls. The trebuchet launched rocks. Attackers breached the castle walls and forced the citizens of Carcassonne out of the town in their underwear. And after just 6 days, things were getting desperate. Bodies were piling up and the city had little access to water. Raymond Roger was taken prisoner and the city surrendered and the residents forced to leave the town. Must be terrible, right? Being just one day you're just living your life inside a very secure fortress or castle, and then one day an army just literally kicks you out. Difficult life. Would you have wanted any of these jobs in a castle? Could be a butler, where you had to be in charge of the buttery, which is important because some of the contents in it were expensive. You've got bread and other food, wine and beer. A rat catcher. Obviously, that's important because they eat all the food and carry diseases. A cook. Many different types of cook. Head cooks, roasting cooks, soup cooks, sauce cooks. Armourer. A skilled job making and taking care of custom-made suits of armour. A chandler. Stone walls and small windows made the rooms of a castle very dark, so the candles were the main source of light. So the chandler kept making candles and keeping an eye on their supply. Oh dear, toilet cleaner. People sat on a wooden plank or slab of stone with a hole in it, and their waste fell into the moat or a pit simple smell not that every so often the toilet cleaner had to empty out the pit. Very much the short straw of castle jobs, I suppose. Here we have the Wartburg Castle in Germany. This is February 1522. Now the castle, these German castles really do stand the test of time. Look at that, it looks pretty much exactly as it probably does back then. Built in central Germany by Count Louis the Springer to defend the borders of his lands, and much of the castle was rebuilt in the 14th century after a lightning strike. Wow, devastating. And after years of neglect, the castle was restored again in the 20th century. Okay, so it's had a lot of work done to it. Count Louis had soil from his own property dug up and moved to Wartburg site so that he could claim the new castle was his own land, even though it wasn't. Great ingenuity. So it's rising from the forest on a rocky cliff, some 722 feet above the city of Eisenach. It was host to many important visitors, which included St. Elizabeth of Hungary, who built a hospital where she cared for the sick, Richard Wagner, the composer. Wagner wrote an opera about a singing contest held there, and a monk called Martin Luther, who of course decided to challenge the Catholic Church, hiding in the castle under a fake name. So there's Martin Luther, obviously a huge historical figure who helped start a movement called the Reformation in protest against the power and control of the Catholic Church. And he secretly worked on translating the Bible into German from ancient Greek so ordinary people could read and understand its words. Democratizing religion, I suppose, and decentralizing the power of the Catholic Church. This is a view inside, look very grand. The festival hall runs the length of the top floor of the palace. It was used for large banquets, but today hosts live music. And it inspired the Singers' Hall in Neuschwanstein Castle, which is an amazing castle. Mosaics were made to the glass and shell and gold were added to this room to tell the story of Elizabeth of Hungary's life, especially her work caring for the sick. Knight's Hall, Prince's bedroom, the Lutherstube. This is where Martin Luther worked. A plain and simple space, but it looks like they've really tried to keep it as it was for visitors. That'd be a very interesting castle to go and visit. I must add it to the list, the endless list of places to visit. Crac de Chevalier in Syria. Rain brought a temporary halt to the fierce battle raging at Crac de Chevalier. Warriors led by the Sultan of Egypt, Baibars, had launched an attack on the Knights Hospitaller inside the castle. Apparently a letter tricked them into surrendering. The castle, as it looks today, was created in the 13th century. And wow, the huge storerooms of the castle could hold food and supplies to last 5 years. An earthquake crumbled the original chapel in 1170. It's a shame how natural disasters can greatly sweep away history. But again, another strong demonstration that no matter what you do and no matter how strong you think what you have is, Mother Nature will always find a way. We've got some castle defences here. Portcullis. A heavy gate called a portcullis would be slid in front of a doorway. These are usually made of wood that was sometimes covered with a layer of iron. Of course, the classic moat filled with water. Crenellations, topped with tooth-like sections with gaps in between. So if you didn't ever know what they were called, they're called crenellations. So you could hide behind those and then dash out to release an arrow in an attack. Murder holes. That's an endearing term, isn't it? Openings in the ceiling above an entrance, where they poured heavy rocks or red-hot sand through them to rain down on attackers. Drawbridge. Classic. Of course, the foundations, tools sloped foundations, so they were hard to surmount. first time I've heard the term crenellations. That's a great little learning point there for me. Windsor Castle. Of course we have Windsor Castle today, which is still very much as it was, but has been reshaped a lot, but it still is lived in. You would have seen it in royal weddings and things like that. Actually inspired by the castle in 1917, the British royal family changed their last name to Windsor. Strategically situated above the River Thames, used to guard England's capital city, London, from enemy attacks. But here, 1278, a grand event called the Tournament of Peace was about to begin. Heralds sounded trumpets, flags were raised, and the crowd streamed out from the castle to see the spectacle. The 3 wards covered an area bigger than 7 football pitches, enormous. Windsor's first chapel was the Chapel of St. Edward the Confessor, constructed by Henry III in the early 13th century. He had the River Thames up here. Windsor Castle is amazing. You should visit it if you're interested in castles. It's pristine. Really give you a great sense of a castle as to what it was like and what it is. You've got St. George's Chapel here. Yes, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were married at St. George's. Yes, they were. And I think it's where monarchs are laid to rest as well. I think Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip are buried there, I think. St. George's Hall. Grand banquets. Over 150 guests can sit down to dinner. Grand reception room. The Garter throne room. It's where you're, if you become a member of the Order of the Garter, an OBE, you can be invited there to be knighted, I think. Next up we have Bomei Castle in Wales, April 1318, which would become famous as one of the greatest castles never finished. On the island of Anglesey, just off mainland Wales. King Edward I of England created it as part of his conquest of Wales and even moved to the nearby town of Llanface so he could build it, but it became distracted by war elsewhere, and although some work continued after his death, the castle was never completed. It was used in the 17th century during the English Civil War, but later fell into disrepair. So it looks like it's still, a lot of the ruins are still there today. And ships could sail right up to the dock of a coastal fortress, bringing materials in. It'll be interesting to go and see. Podium Castle, June 1391. Sir Edward Dallingrig, what a name, was one of the loyal knights of King Edward III of England. He earned fame and fortune battling the French in 1367, then returned home to marry. He decided to protect his lands again when trouble with the French stirred up by building Podium Castle. It was built all in one go, almost perfectly symmetrical, and the castle's tower looked even more imposing when reflected in the shallow moat surrounding them. Wow, look at it today. Look at that beauty. The castle became a ruin, was never repaired, but look at it, the outside. And the moat tricked enemies into thinking that the castle was taller than it actually was because of its reflective surface. Ponds were filled with huge fish to feed the hungry castle residents. It also served as a sewer. Oh dear, that's not nice, is it? Medieval tournaments, very famous of course. Horses for jousting, melee. Teams of knights fought each other. They formed a line and tried to break through the opposition's ranks, armed with clubs, swords, poles or spears. And then in another version, every knight fought fought for himself against the others. Tournaments were usually held near the host's castle, where an area called a tilt yard was built for jousting contests. Bran Castle. Now, this is the notorious warlord Vlad the Impaler, with his rampaging army of soldiers. This time the castle would be spared. He was on his way to attack the nearby city of Brasov, but he attacked the village below the castle to remind everyone who was in charge. It was strategically built in the 14th century in a mountain pass between two regions of Romania and Wallachia and Transylvania. Bran Castle is sometimes linked to the castle in the book Dracula by Bram Stoker, but this castle in the story is fictional, as is the vampire. But Vlad's nickname was Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. And Salzburg Fortress in Austria, November the 15th, sorry, I keep getting these as dates, November 1524. Towered over the city of Salzburg in the 15th century, Archbishop Leonhard von Kutschach grew worried about attacks and decided to turn the original fortress into one of the biggest in Central Europe. One unusual feature was the railway built to bring goods up the steep hill into the castle. Around 1,000 people worked in the inner ward. A private railway built sometimes around 1500, and animals or people pulled ropes to bring the wooden car up to the castle. It's rather ingenious, isn't it? From the 16th century, residents in the castle were woken up by the Salzburg bull, a pipe organ with more than 200 pipes. Wow. And the only time its defences were tested was in 1525, where many of the peasants in the German-speaking areas of Europe were fed up. The nobles who ruled them were increasing taxes and demanding extra work. One group near Salzburg, which included miners, farmers and ordinary people, marched on the city in 1525, where they launched a 3-month attack on the castle, where Archbishop Matthias was hiding out in luxurious surroundings. It was a 2-year war that raged across Central Europe, but well-trained armies wiped out the inexperienced rebels. They agreed a truce with Matthias, but ultimately nothing changed. Peasants were led by Michael Gaismer, who wanted a more equal society. Many miners were part of the peasant army, and they attempted to dig a tunnel under the castle walls to get in, but they didn't succeed. And the tunnel was blocked up, so the peasants couldn't enter. Jalon Castle in Switzerland. Oh wow, look at that there. Look at it today. A lakeside lodge built in the 12th century by the Savoy family, protected mountain trade route to Italy and ships crossing Lake Geneva. English poet Lord Byron visited Jalon and carved his own name into one of the dungeon pillars. Interesting. The fabulously wealthy Savoy family lived in this compact castle positioned between the edge of Lake Geneva and the soaring Swiss Alps. For centuries, anyone foolish enough to oppose the Dukes of Savoy could be sent to its grisly dungeon, as these was monk Francois Bonaparte found out when he challenged the authority of Duke Charles III. He spent 6 long years locked up in Jalon before the Bernese captured the castle and freed him in 1536. Beautiful looking building. And again another building that has greatly stood the test of time. And this is inside it. Lovely chapel. Beautifully painted. Bernese chamber. Look at the patterns of La Magna, feasts and grand receptions. Domus Clericorum, and the castle was run from in here, at a dungeon, cold, dark room in the depths of the castle. So Lord Byron will have put his name in there somewhere if you want to go and find it. I think that's a natural point to pause and end this first part of Castles. A lovely book. I'm really enjoying reading through the brief history and seeing the images of these castles, many of which I haven't seen before. Thank you for joining me for this whispered read-through of Castles. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, goodbye.